Hello, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you today to this latest in my series of St. John's Pipecasts. My name is Ian St. John, and my topic today will be T.E. Lawrence's book, The Seven Pillars of Wisdom. Now, extracting the real Thomas Edward Lawrence from the mythical Lawrence of Arabia has been a flourishing academic industry since at least 1955, when Richard Aldington published his iconoclastic Lawrence of Arabia, a biographical inquiry, which set out to debunk the numerous legends that coalesced around Lawrence's name since his death in a motorcycle accident in 1935. Accident, did I say? Or was it a political assassination? That is a life question, just one of countless others. Lawrence the man was fertile in myths enough. His very name was mythical. As a young man, he went by Thomas Edward Lawrence. When he died, as Thomas Edward Shaw. And in between, he was known as John Hume Ross. But none of these was his birth name, which was Thomas Edward Chapman. Lawrence was the illegitimate son of Sir Thomas Chapman, an Anglo-Irish gentleman who fled his ancestral home due to a liaison with his children's governess, Sarah Lawrence. So Lawrence was given his mother's name, ironically, since her actual surname was Juna, and she'd only acquired the name Lawrence because her mother, who was a servant in the house of a Mr. Lawrence in Sunderland, had been made pregnant by her employer's son. Lawrence was thus illegitimate on both sides of his family, and his given surname of Lawrence actually derived from an accountant in Sunderland. This tangled family history also explains why Lawrence was technically Welsh, since after fleeing Ireland with his parents, they lived in Wales, where Lawrence was born in 1888. This had one significant consequence, for it explains why he later attended Jesus College in Oxford, which had historic ties to Wales and Welsh students. And the convoluted threads of Lawrence's parentage prefigure the complex and often obscure paths his life would follow. And if Lawrence's existence tended towards the mythological, it comes as no surprise that this is no less true of his great book, The Seven Pillars of Wisdom, A Triumph, which appeared in 1926. It would be too strong a word to say published. Lawrence was something of a myth factory. He had a quirky, awkward personality and relished making an impression. As a child, he was known for peddling his bicycle uphill and then walking it down the slope ensuing. When a teenager, he moved out of his family home in North Oxford to live in a purpose-built bungalow in the garden with special soundproof walls. He later claimed, at the age of 17, he ran away from home and joined the army, only to be extracted by his parents. But no evidence exists for this in army records. Such a man, setting down to write a history of his own exploits, couldn't help but produce a book in which fact and fiction mingled, and which fed the very legendary status of his life, which he on so many other occasions lamented. It is said of Lawrence that he was someone who backed into the limelight, and no phrase, I think, better sums him up as a personality. And in The Seven Pillars, he backed into a light he did all he could to fuel. So what is the book about? First, a title. The phrase Seven Pillars of Wisdom derives from the biblical book of Proverbs, where it states, "Wisdom hath builded a house. She hath hewn out her 7 pillars. There are no pillars of wisdom in Lawrence's book, and the title bears no relation to the contents. Lawrence had come upon the text as a young man, and in 1910 had planned to use it for a travel book about 7 cities of the Middle East, Damascus, Jerusalem, and so on. This book was never written. Instead, he took the title over and applied it to the book he did write. This book is an account of Lawrence's personal role in a revolt amongst Arab tribes against Turkish rule in Arabia during World War I. Arabia was, when the war began, part of the Ottoman Empire. That empire had included Egypt too, but this had been seized by the British in the 1880s. Turkey was allied to Germany in the war, and so was at war with Britain as well. And the British hatched an idea of encouraging an Arab revolt against Turkish rule as a means of weakening Turkish power and possibly opening up a Middle Eastern front against the Central European powers. Lawrence was drawn into the scheme since he was, in the years prior to the war, working as an archaeologist in Carchemish in northern Syria, and as a result knew Arabic. When the war began, he joined the army and was employed in military intelligence in Cairo, Egypt, spying on the Turks and liaising with the Arabs. Thus it came about that when the plan to spark an Arab uprising was activated, Lawrence was one of those who were sent into Arabia to make contact with Arab leaders and direct their operations. Now, the nominal leader of the revolt was the Emir Hussein of Mecca, but he was elderly and active operations were led by his 4 sons. It was one of these, Faisal, whom Lawrence met at Wadi Safra in 1916. Lawrence recounted the meeting in the 7 Pillars. "And how?" Faisal asked. "Do you like our place here at Wadi Safra?" To which Lawrence, who was eager to push Arab claims and conquer as much of Turkish territory as possible, replied, "Well, but it is far from Damascus." To encourage the Arabs, Lawrence, on behalf of the British government, promised them that if the Turks were vanquished, then the Arabs could replace them as rulers of Arabia. Yet this was duplicitous, for the British had already agreed in the Sykes-Picot Agreement with the French, who were jealous of Britain's intrigues in the region, that the Turkish territories would be partitioned between them when the war was over, and it was the French who would acquire Syria. Lawrence knew this, but first there was a war to win against the Germans and the Turks, and second, he always believed in the concept of an Arab nation, and he held the conviction that the more land the Arabs could liberate for themselves from Turkish rule, the more they could stake a claim to territory once the war was over. Indeed, one of his motives for writing the 7 Pillars shortly after the war was to emphasize the Arab role in the defeat of the Turks, so as to advance their cause, though it also served the purpose of absolving him of the sense of guilt he felt at having misled them regarding British intentions. What the 7 Pillars does, then, is narrate Lawrence's personal involvement in the Arab revolt, culminating in the capture of Damascus by Arab forces in October 1918, just as the war ended. Of the military history of the campaign, I shall not speak. What I wish to focus on is the book as a book. To understand the 7 Pillars of Wisdom, one needs to understand Lawrence as a person. He was, to begin with, highly intellectual and introspective. As a young man, he was fascinated by medieval history. He was the kind of person who read the Morte d'Arthur and who cycled around country churches making brass rubbings. Such young people don't really exist today. But in late Victorian England, they were a familiar type. One thinks of William Morris, the hero of Lawrence's, and someone Lawrence planned to emulate by setting up a hand printing press, as Morris had done. Lawrence's family lived in Oxford, and he attended the university studying history. He was a fine scholar, but even at this point he had a restless and daring spirit. He excelled in the old Oxford pastime of roof climbing. He apparently steered a canoe along an underground stream that ran beneath the city. And for his BA thesis, he embarked in 1910 on an audacious visit to Syria and Palestine, travelling hundreds of miles alone and on foot, taking pictures and sketching castles built in the Middle East by crusading knights. As a romantic, Lawrence was drawn to medieval chivalry and tales of the Knights Templar. From this one can see why the chance to be involved in a revolt in Arabia was like manna in the desert for Lawrence. For he discovered that the Arab Bedouin lived in ways that had barely changed since the medieval ages he so loved. They journeyed through the desert on camels and horses, raiding their neighbours' lands and stealing and trading camels, led by charismatic warriors, the greatest of whom, Aldu Abu Tai, Lawrence immortalised in the Seven Pillars. Lawrence was dazzled. By accident, he had stumbled upon a world he'd only read about in the Iliad and tales of Richard the Lionheart. That past was, in the deserts of Arabia, a living present, and Lawrence was at the centre of it. Unsurprisingly, he soon discarded Western clothes and dressed as an Arab, complete with dagger. For an introverted young man who had dwelt mentally in gorgeous ancient lands, it was a fantasy become real. And he admitted as much in the first chapter of his book. All men dream, but not equally. Those who dream by night, in the dusty recesses of their minds, wake in the day to find that it was vanity. But the dreamers of the day are dangerous men, for they may act out their dream with open eyes to make it possible. This I did. Another of Lawrence's medieval attributes was a hankering after asceticism. Lawrence shunned pleasure, ease, and luxury. He liked to push himself, to live in Spartan conditions, to suffer. Remember how he walked downhill with his bike? How he set off on foot through Syria while beset with malaria to draw castles? He was asexual, apparently never having a boy or girlfriend. Later in life, he demonstrated masochistic tendencies and paid a soldier to whip him whilst tied to a bed. All this made him highly receptive to the hard, unforgiving life of the Bedouin, who travelled long distances to the desert beneath the burning sun, with little in the way of food or creature comforts. It was a world, too, without women, which Lawrence found congenial. As he wrote in the first chapter of the Seven Pillars, the body was too coarse to feel the utmost of our sorrows and of our joys. Therefore we abandoned it as rubbish. We left it below us to march forward. Blood was always on our hands. We were licensed to it. Wounding and killing seemed ephemeral pains, So very brief and sore was this life with us. With the sorrow of living so great, the sorrow of punishment had to be pitiless. We lived for the day and died for it. When there was reason and desire to punish, we wrote our lesson with gun or whip immediately in the sudden flesh of the sufferer, and the case was beyond appeal. Bedouin ways were hard even for those brought up to them, and for strangers terrible. A death in life. The next thing one must grasp to properly appraise the Seven Pillars is that Lawrence yearned to be a great writer. In his youth, he had been immersed in literature. One of his legends was that he had read 50,000 books by the age of 21, and he wanted to emulate those writers he most admired. He had been projecting various books before the war began, and now by chance he had stumbled upon a subject almost too magnificent to be real, a first-hand account of a revolt in the desert. It was a tale that unfolded amidst dramatic and exotic scenery, a land of vast sand dunes, towering cliffs of coloured rock, of ruined civilizations and brilliant sunsets. One thinks, for example, of his descriptions of his most favoured of places, the immense valley of Wadi Rum. The crags were capped with nests of domes, less hotly red than the body of the hill, rather grey and shallow, that gave the finishing semblance of Byzantine architecture to this irresistible place, this processional way greater than imagination. The Arab armies would have been lost in the length and breadth of it, and within the walls a squadron of aeroplanes could have wheeled in formation. Adil Caravan grew self-conscious, and we fell dead quiet, afraid and ashamed to flaunt its smallness in the presence of the stupendous hills. Landscapes in childhood's dream were so vast and silent. It had a cast of ready-made characters who appeared to have stepped from the pages of the Arabian Nights and narrated the epic story of an unprecedented and ultimately successful campaign, full of daring, heroism and disaster. And Lawrence was the only British person to witness much of it firsthand, which meant, of course, he had license to tell the story as he saw it and as he wanted to say it, and to structure the account around his own perceptions and feelings, giving vent to his own ego. It was gifted to him to write his own modern-day Iliad or Odyssey, with himself cast as the character of Achilles or Odysseus. It was too good to be true, and for an aspiring writer who confessed to wishing to write a book on the scale of the Brothers Karamazov or Moby Dick, it was irresistible. The result was the Seven Pillars of Wisdom, a self-consciously literary endeavour to evoke the world of the Arabs and Lance's part within it. Realising that he had incredible material for a book, he began almost from day one to keep detailed notes of events and scenes. By 1919, he had fixed upon the idea of producing an epic account of the Arab revolt. A friend, to whom he confided his plan in Cairo, commented that Lawrence would someday be able to write a unique book. Generally, the kind of men capable of these adventures lack the pen and wit to record them adequately. Luckily, Lawrence is specially gifted in both. Lawrence began to write the book whilst attending the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, where he was a member of the Arab delegation. During those 5 months in Paris, he wrote 160,000 words, roughly 6 books. But then disaster struck. Whilst changing trains at Reading on a trip to Oxford, he somehow managed to leave the bag containing the manuscript in a waiting room. When he telephoned back on arriving in Oxford to Reading, The station staff could find no trace of it. It was lost and never recovered, as were the photographs and notes the bag also contained. Now, whether this really happened must be questioned. It seemed decidedly odd that Lawrence could mislay something so vital to him. But the fact remains that Lawrence was in a highly distressed state. But the projected book was too important to be abandoned, so he sat down to write it again. By now Lawrence was a Fellow of All Souls College, Oxford. For complaining that he could not settle down to write in Oxford, he moved into the upstairs rooms of the office of the architect of New Delhi, Sir Herbert Baker, at 14 Barton Street in London. The Spartan setting suited Lawrence. There was no heating, washing, or cooking facilities. So, sitting in a padded RAF pilot's coat and subsisting only on sandwiches, he sat at a desk and wrote out the whole book from memory, writing, he said, for hours at a stretch. To make up for missing details, he emphasised the physical drama of the Arabian scene. By April, a complete draft of 400,000 words was complete. Over the next 2 years, Lawrence, who was by then employed by Winston Churchill as his advisor on Middle Eastern affairs, returned off and on to the book, cutting down the text to 330,000 words. Wanting to make it a masterpiece, he studied the writing techniques of modern authors he most admired. He also began to commission a large number of portraits of leading figures in the revolt, noted by the artist and sculptor Eric Kennington. It was typical of Lawrence to combine ambition and egotism with timidity and self-abasement, and he continually lamented the book's inadequacies and his inability to make it right. "The real trouble," he wrote to Kennington, "is about my book, which is not good enough to come out." This at the same time as he was spending large sums of money paying for works of art to adorn its pages. Hardly the action of someone who's seriously doubting whether the book is good enough to see light. Whatever his misgivings, Lawrence decided to have the revised manuscript, which he completed by May 1922, set up in type at the printing works of the Oxford Mail newspaper. The result was the Oxford text of 1922, of which the first 3 bound volumes were complete by August 1922, by which time Lawrence had made his eccentric decision to re-enlist in the RAF as a private under the name of Ross. The volume contained the opening dedicatory poem to someone designated S.A., which began, "I loved you, so I drew these tides of men into my hands and wrote my will across the sky in stars, to gain you freedom, the 7-pillared worthy house, that your eyes might be shining for me when I came. Death was my servant on the road, till we were near and saw you waiting, when you smiled, and in sorrowful envy he outran me and took you apart into his quietness." There's been much speculation as to who S.A. was. It's generally accepted that it was his old Arab friend Dahum, whom Lawrence had known in Syria before the war and whom he had brought on a visit to Oxford, but who had died during the war itself. By now, over 30 portraits and landscape pictures had been commissioned for the volume. Yet despite all the cost and effort and time, Lawrence still complained that it was inadequate and not worthy of publication. He wrote to the artist Paul Nash, "I wrote a book about Arabia. To publish it would involve me in as many libels as there are characters. Also, it is not good enough to publish, but it is good enough for me to make better, till it can be published in the course of years. By August 1922, Lawrence was receiving the first of an eventual 8 printed volumes from the Oxford Mail Press. He sent one to George Bernard Shaw, then Britain's leading playwright. Another was sent to the writer and publisher Edward Garnett, to whom Lawrence claimed that he had no ambition to publish the book and wrote it just for himself. But after Garnett had read the book, he replied in effusive terms about the text, and then Lawrence wrote, "Confession is in the air. Do you remember my telling you once that I collected a shelf of Titanic books, those distinguished by greatness of spirit, and that they were the Karamazovs, Zarathustra, and Moby Dick? Well, my ambition was to make an English 4th. You will observe that modesty comes out more in the performance than in the aim. I had hopes all the while that there was going to be a big thing, and wrote myself knee blind in the effort. Then it was finished, and I sent it to the printer, and when it came back in fresh shape, I saw that it was no good." Garnett offered to do an abridgment of the book of about 150,000 words, the plan being to sell the abridgment in the United States to raise money to cover the expenses of the actual 7 pillars, which Lawrence, now simply a regular soldier, could hardly afford. But Lawrence hesitated. Bernard Shaw was strong against the plan, pressing Lawrence to publish the entire manuscript as it stood. Instead, in 1923, Lawrence floated the idea of publishing the 7 Pillars as a privately printed limited edition of 2,000 copies to be sold by subscription. Garnett's publishers, Jonathan Cape, agreed to the plan, but still Lawrence dithered, continued to doubt the merits of the book whilst remaining fixated upon it, and admitting privately that it was a great work. He deposited the original manuscript in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, again covering the egotism of the gesture with a veneer of self-deprecation. In giving my manuscript to the Bodleian, I acted perhaps unhumorously, taking myself a little too seriously as a classic. Whether the library has a treasure or not, the next century can tell. It rids me of a bulky, weighty volume. Copies of the Oxford text continued to circulate, and Lawrence, who was now in the Army Tank Corps, relished the praise he received, whilst continuing to deprecate its quality. Though he wrote in May 1923, "I can see no good of my book, yet I'm glad when others praise it. I hate it and like it by turns. I know that it's a good bit of writing, and often wish it wasn't. If I'd aimed less high, I'd have hit my mark squarer and made a better little thing of it. As it stands, it's a great failure." The eventual plan was to print 120 copies at a price of £25 each, which would be about £1,000 in modern values, which would yield in the money of those times £3,000. But Lawrence was embarrassed at the thought that he might profit personally from the venture, so he stated he would receive no royalties. The sum raised was to cover the costs of printing only, including the large number of sumptuous illustrations. He began to plan the format of the book. Lawrence had a great interest in the technical process of printing, and by the end of 1923 he had settled on a large quarto format to accommodate the paintings, consisting of 230,000 words over 430 pages, set in Caslon 11-point font. Yet still his plans changed. By December 1923, he resolved upon a print run of 100 copies, to be sold to subscribers at 30 guineas apiece, and a total of 330,000 words. By January 1924, 12 subscribers had signed up, including Earl Grey, the Foreign Secretary at the time of Britain's entry into World War I, and the Peter Pan author, J.M. Barrie. Lawrence was happy. "It will be rather a fine volume, and unless I'm wrong, a celebrated one day. The problem was that when Lawrence revisited the manuscript, he became increasingly dissatisfied with its style. It had been written in a high, elaborate and complex prose, more typical of the Edwardian age. And as Lawrence studied more modernist writers like Eliot and Joyce, he began to favour a simpler, more direct and less affected way of writing. A long letter from E.M. Forster criticising Lawrence's over-elaborate and obscure sentences only confirmed this assessment. Thus, by 1924, Lawrence had become less optimistic about the book. Not only was the style wrong, but he had only 26 subscribers, and costs were mounting. He set to work to cut the book and tighten the writing, planning to reduce the length by 10%. By September, he had 80 subscribers. It was now that George Bernard Shaw finally read the manuscript and replied with yet more advice, especially regarding punctuation, and recommending the suppression of the first chapter. Problems still mounted. Only 3 of the 11 books had actually been set up in type, and by December 1924, it was apparent that even the subscribers edition would make a loss of £1,000. To make good the shortfall, Lawrence took up again the idea of a popular 125,000-word abridgment. Jonathan Cape agreed and offered Lawrence £3,000 for the projected volume, which came to be called The Revolt in the Desert and appeared in 1927, 1 year after the full version. Flushed with more funds, Lawrence proceeded to commission yet more pictures. During 1935, progress accelerated, and by mid-1925, the subscribed edition was largely complete. The final printing went ahead in 1926, though the general strike of that year slowed things down yet again. But by December 1926, the printed version of the Seven Pillars was complete and being dispatched to subscribers, the first copy being presented to the Royal Library at Windsor Castle. By this point, Lawrence had re-enlisted in the RAF under the name of Shaw and was serving in India, and it was at Karachi that he received the first letters of thanks and acclaim from those who had subscribed to the volume. The following year, The Revolt in the Desert appeared, the plan being to sell most copies in America, where the volume would do least damage to the reputation of Lawrence and the Seven Pillars. Thus did the subscribers' edition of the Seven Pillars emerge. Lawrence had intended to reduce the Oxford text by 10%. He in fact reduced it by 25%, and some chapters were cut much more, especially towards the end of the book. Chapter 7 was cut by 29%, Chapter 9 by 32%, and Chapter 8 by 47%. The volume came in at 250,579 words, compared to the Oxford text's 334,566 words. It is generally believed that the cutting was a mistake. Lawrence cut more than he needed, and he cut erratically, as we've seen, cutting more and more of the book as he went along, believing erroneously that he had not cut enough in the early stages. The style also shifted, as Lawrence sought a simpler, less expansive style, which may have been good for literary purposes, but left some of the sentences and the narrative unclear. He also became increasingly fussy about the printed form of the text. For example, he tried to ensure that every page began with a new paragraph, and every paragraph end at the end of a line. Notwithstanding these minor obsessions, the book was rich with brilliant and arresting passages. One thinks, for example, of the famous chapter 13, where Lawrence related how, sick and confined to his tent with fever, he sketched out in his mind a theory of the Arab revolt, reflecting upon how the mobile but numerically small Arab forces could best challenge the regular armies of the Turks, in the process formulating what remains one of the key texts of guerrilla warfare. And I quote, "My whips, hostile to the abstract, took refuge in Arabia again. Translated into Arabic, the algebraic factor would first take practical account of the area we wished to deliver, and I began idly to calculate how many square miles, 60, 80, 100, perhaps 140,000 square miles. And how would the Turks defend all that? No doubt by a trench line across the bottom, if we came like an army with banners. But suppose we were, as we might be, an influence, an idea, a thing intangible, invulnerable, without front or back, drifting about like a gas. Armies were like plants, immobile, firm-rooted, nourished through long stems to the head. We might be a vapour, blowing where we listed. Our kingdoms lay in each man's mind, and as we wanted nothing material to live on, so we might offer nothing material to the killing." The most disputed part of the book was Lawrence's account of his capture by the Turks in the town of Dura, which caused him to be led naked before the governor of the town, Hakim Bey, who, after Lawrence resisted his sexual advances, ordered that he be whipped and beaten. Lawrence described in detail the beating he received, with repeated lashes of the whip. "Always for the first of every new series, my head will be pulled round, to see a hard white ridge like a railway darkening slowly into crimson, leaped over my skin at the instant of each stroke, with a bead of blood where two ridges crossed. As the punishment proceeded, the whip fell more and more upon existing wheels, biting blacker or more wet, till my flesh quivered with accumulated pain, and with terror of the next blow coming. They soon conquered my determination not to cry, but while my will ruled my lips, I used only Arabic, and before the end a merciful sickness choked my utterance." Considerable ingenuity by a series of biographers has been devoted to resolving whether such a beating actually happened. Much has been found to discount the idea. The fact that the Turkish governor was known to be heterosexual and made no reference to Lawrence in his diaries. The curious fact that Lawrence was allowed to escape, that his wounds soon healed, and that the timing of the visit to Dura cannot be made to fit with his other known movements. This has led many to conclude either that the incident happened at some other time and was transposed to Dura, or it never happened at all, and rather gave expression to Lawrence's known taste for masochistic punishment. It is another of those episodes that draws an aura of mystery around Lawrence's life. This was the text that was circulated in Lawrence's lifetime, the Oxford text remaining unpublished. When Lawrence died in a motorcycle accident in 1935, it was the subscribed edition that was rushed into print within 6 weeks. 100,000 copies were sold within 6 months, and this is one of those 1936 productions in the wake of Lawrence's death. So 1935 edition, sorry. Only 62 years later was an edition of the 1922 Oxford text published, overseen by Jeremy Wilson. And that's that volume here. This is the Oxford 1922 edition, published by Wilson, or edited by Wilson. It is this text, rather than the Seven Pillars, which is probably best read by those wishing for the fullest and most comprehensible account of Lawrence's role in the Arab Revolt. I hope my account of the writing and printing of the Seven Pillars helps to explain why the book became yet another element in the myth that is Lawrence of Arabia. It must be one of the most tortuously generated books in history. From the initial decision to write it, and the quick production of the first draft, the loss of that first draft in Reading Railway Station, never to be seen again, The second draft, written in a cold, frugal architect's office in London. The printing of the second draft in just 8 copies by the Oxford Mail newspaper. The protracted wrangling over whether the book should be published at all, and in what form. And finally the decision to produce a privately printed version reduced in length by 25%. Then there was the shifting purpose of the book, which was at once a vehicle for Lawrence's ego regarding his role in the Arab revolt, and a text designed to exaggerate the part played by the Arabs in their own liberation as part of a campaign to assert their claims to territory after the war. And all the while, there was Lawrence's basic ambition to produce a book that was not only aesthetically beautiful, but which would take its place among the classics of world literature. That it eventually did, but only after Lawrence's death in a motorcycle accident, which allowed the work to finally be made available to a wide and international audience. And then there were the controversies contained within its pages. Above all, his account of being captured by the Turks and subjected to a sadistic homosexual assault, which left him repulsed and excited, which several historians believe never happened at all. What this amounts to is to say that the Seven Pillars is a great work in every sense of the word. It is great in size and publication values, with numerous illustrations and careful attention to printed style. It has for its subject matter a dramatic story set among Bedouin tribes amidst the fantastic scenery of the Arabian desert. As a work of literature, it is replete with vivid descriptions, anguished introspection, and arresting prose. At its centre is a great man, namely T.E. Lawrence, aka Chapman, aka Shaw, aka Ross, a complex, contradictory compound of scholar and man of action, half hero, half attention-seeking charlatan, inspiring, frustrating, and absurd by turns. Only a person so tortured could have produced a text so tensely wrought. But in doing so, Lawrence immortalised his persona as Lawrence of Arabia, the only one among the millions of combatants in World War I whom anyone and everyone has heard of. Lawrence, in the title of John Mack's biography, is a prince of our disorders. And as a testament to the struggle of a highly educated and self-absorbed literary scholar, shaped by the neuroses of an Edwardian English culture, to maintain an identity amidst the storm centres of war, empire and nationalism within the Middle Eastern world, at once so familiar and yet so alien, it stands as a 20th century classic. In this at least, it vindicated Lawrence's subtitle, A Triumph. Thank you.